What moment made you say, yep, I'm definitely dead, but you survived? Story 1. Back in college, while living in an apartment complex, my dryer stopped working. I'm not particularly handy, and I don't remember exactly how I diagnosed the issue,
Listo.
but I somehow came to the conclusion that the power cord was either burned out or had a short. So I pulled the plug out of the wall, detached it from the back of the dryer, and took it to one of those cluttered, hoarder-esque appliance repair shops that most small towns seem to have. I bought a replacement and headed back
Voy a
home.
llevar las cosas que
Back
se
at my
pueden
apartment,
vender,
with the dryer pulled away from the wall, I started reattaching the new cord when I had the brilliant idea to double-check that the plug matched the outlet. If you've ever seen the cords and outlets that some big appliances use, you know they're not the standard three-prong setup like a floor lamp. These are 220 volts slash 240 volts monsters designed to move massive amounts of
no tenía
electricity.
internet.
Without any concern for how real life works, I plugged the unattached dryer cord into the outlet. The second the prongs made a connection, a blue fireball exploded from the dangling contacts on the other end of the cord, and all the lights in my apartment went out. I just sat there dumbstruck. The exposed contacts were inches away from my leg. I took a moment to process the sheer level of stupidity and the fact that I probably didn't deserve to be an unsupervised adult. Once the adrenaline rush faded into full-body shakes, I called the apartment complex handyman and turned myself in. He laughed and said, "So that's why the power in the whole building went out."
Okay, yes.
Fantastic. An hour later, everything was back up and running, except my self-esteem. Story 2. I was riding my bicycle at a high speed,
Vamos a ver si
tucked
se
into
puede
the aero
comprar
position.
comida. Si no,
When you're on
ya
aero
tendré
bars,
que
you have to take your
desocupar.
hands off them to reach the brakes. As I was flying down the road, I approached a downhill turn that turned out to be steeper than I
Okay.
expected. Because of the
porque
combination of my
¿tú no lo
speed,
seguiste jugando
the incline, and the
el video?
curve, I was having a hard time getting my hands off the aero bars in time. Finally, I managed to grab my rear brake, just as I went off the left side of the paved trail. Luckily,
Pero es que a mí
the
ya no
ground
me
beside the
apetece
trail
jugar
was
por
muddy,
ahora en el
which slowed me
celular,
down
entonces,
just enough to regain control of the
porque me
bike.
instalé el
I
mobile,
somehow managed to stop right in the
Mobile
middle of the
Legends,
path. I looked around,
pero no lo
expecting
jugué,
someone
o
to have
sea,
witnessed my miraculous
lo jugué
recovery.
solamente
But there was
para
no one.
subir,
So,
para subir
I
de
raised my
rápido
arms to the
y lo
sky
abandoné.
and, no joke,
Llegué a
declared,
Leyenda
"I'm
y
a
lo
bad
abandoné.
mother." Well, you get the idea. Story 3. Back in college, I was at a big house party in some rundown off-campus house. I was up on the third floor balcony with a bunch of people just hanging out. Another guy and I were leaning back against the railing, talking, when suddenly it snapped. Time slowed down.
¿Dónde era que se
To this day,
mejoraba
I can
para
still remember the horrified expressions on the faces of the people around me
unir esto con
as I fell backward. It was about a 25-foot drop, and in that moment, I was certain I was about to die. I might have flipped, I don't know,
Caramba.
but I hit the ground on my back with a brutal thud. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for what felt like an eternity, I couldn't inhale. When I finally regained some awareness, I saw my friend kneeling over me. He was in the army at the time and was already assessing me. I felt an
Okay,
intense pain in my legs and tried to move, but he held me down, telling me not to in case I had a spinal
La
injury.
reforja no
Long
era,
story
¿no?
short, I got lucky. Just some deep bone bruising on my feet from when they slapped against the ground after I landed flat on my back. The other guy wasn't so lucky. I landed in a soft, muddy lawn. He hit a concrete patio. He broke his spine in 2 places and suffered a slight skull fracture. On a lighter note, when they took me to the hospital, I had to pee badly. I had
No,
been
pero a mí sí
drinking
me
after
gustó
all.
porque
They
creo
gave me
que el juego
morphine
recién
and didn't want me
salía
moving around since I hadn't been
y
x-rayed yet.
este,
My best friend's girlfriend, who had come with me because we were old friends, helped me use a urinal. She took it to dump in the
Adel,
sink, but
los
suddenly
pantalones,
tripped, lost her
Adel.
grip, and basically launched it into the hallway of the ER, sending my pee everywhere. The ER staff was not amused. Story 4. A few years ago, I went camping next to a river. That night, I got super
ver,
drunk
¿así
and
era?
wandered over to a neighboring campsite to drink even more. When I eventually stumbled back through the pitch-black woods, pushing
era?
through
¿Cómo
bushes
que?
and trees, my legs suddenly vanished from under me. I had stepped straight into the river, in total darkness, drunk as hell. The water was belly-button deep, freezing cold glacier runoff, and the current was strong enough to carry me away without a trace. I could feel my feet slipping against the riverbed, and the bank I was desperately grasping at was shoulder-high and made of dirt. Every time I tried to push off the river floor, the current kept pulling me sideways. I jumped and clawed at the ground above me, probably 10 times, looking for anything to hold on to. I started screaming for help, but no one could hear me over the chaos of the drunk partygoers. One of my friends heard me, but since they couldn't see what was happening, they thought I was just messing around and laughed at my calls for help. At that moment, I was sure I was done for. I was drunk to the point of puking, had zero coordination, and my muscles were cramping from the freezing water and the strain of holding onto that dirt bank. Just as I was about to give up, I felt a tree root deep beneath the surface with my foot. With what little energy I had left, I pushed off it and dug my nails into the dirt, finally managing to haul myself out of the water. It was the most terrifying, sobering moment of my life. Afterward, I ended up puking in the laughing friend's back seat. A true happy ending. Story 5. I was robbed at gunpoint and forced to drive to a secluded road deep in the woods. The guy in the passenger seat told me to get out and walk toward the tree line, while he followed behind me with the gun pointed at my head. All I could think about was my mom. Of course, I didn't want to die, but the thought of her having to go through the pain of me being missing, then eventually being found dead, was worse. When I reached the tree line, he told me to lay down on my stomach. I did as I was told. He backed away and told me not to move for at least 30 minutes before even thinking about getting up. Then he got into the lead car with his buddies and drove off. I'm not the type to claim divine intervention. I'm not even religious. But something made him change his mind about pulling the trigger, and for that, I'm grateful. Story 6. My sister came to pick me up from work in our parents' Subaru. As soon as she pulled up, she mentioned hearing a weird, rhythmic flapping noise and thought it might be a tire issue. We checked them all, but nothing seemed off. No flats, no visible damage. So we decided to drive home and have our dad take a look when we got there. As we got on the freeway, the sound continued. I heard it too, but I couldn't tell what it was. We were going about 70 miles per hour when, suddenly, the back passenger tire completely detached from the car. Everything after that happened in slow motion. My sister lost control, and we started swerving violently across both lanes, the car twisting back and forth. I gripped the seat, powerless against the motion, and thought, this is it. I'm about to die. But somehow we didn't. We were unbelievably lucky. No cars were beside us when it happened, even though we were in the middle lane. When we finally came to a stop, we ended up on the shoulder, facing backward, in the only flat, grassy spot for miles. Every other stretch of that highway had a guardrail with a steep ditch right next to the road. If we had spun out anywhere else, the car could have flipped. Turns out the lug nuts on the right side of the car had all been loosened. After hearing similar stories from people at the university where my dad worked, we believe someone had been going around campus loosening people's tires. Story 7. I overdosed on Xanax. I was in a really dark place mentally and had some Xanax for anxiety. One day I picked up a full pack from the pharmacy, grabbed some sweets from the store to mask the bitterness, and went through with it. I was in my room wearing just my underwear. I remember thinking about how, when my grandfather passed away 20 years earlier in another country, the women in my family had to wash his body before burial. That stuck with me for some reason. Then I fell asleep. My cat curled up next to me, and I didn't wake up until the next morning, when my mom found me. She called an ambulance immediately. I kept slipping in and out of consciousness in the ambulance. Every time I woke up, I told her not to scold me. Of course, she was so scared that was the last thing on her mind. I was discharged the next day, and strangely enough, things got better after that. I realized I didn't actually want to die. I just didn't want to live that life anymore. I had to make some real changes, and I did. Little by little, I worked on improving my life and finding happiness again. Story 8. I've been asthmatic since I was 16, so I always carry my inhaler with me. When I was 24 and in med school, I had just finished a test and was waiting outside the classroom for my then-girlfriend to finish. I went to a very small med school in Mexico, and the hallway was practically empty. Out of nowhere, I felt like sitting down. No particular reason, just an urge. So I sat down on the ground, my back against the wall. Then suddenly I started struggling to breathe. I reached for my backpack, searching frantically for my inhaler, but it was nowhere to be found. I dumped everything out. Nothing. The hallway remained empty, and I was completely alone, gasping for air. It was getting worse by the second. Panic set in as I crumpled onto my side, my arms, legs, and face going completely numb. I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. I could feel my rib cage and thoracic muscles working overtime to try and pull in air. My lungs wheezed so loudly that people in the surrounding classroom started pouring into the hallway. My girlfriend ran out, screaming for help. One of the professors rushed over, placed a stethoscope on my chest, and I heard her say that almost no air was getting in or out. As my consciousness started to fade, I heard someone mention that the first aid kit in the building was locked. They couldn't get to it. My eyes closed, and I realized I'm dying. Tears streamed down my face as the world around me faded into silence. Then suddenly a rush. Air filled my lungs in a massive gasp. I looked down at my leg and saw a syringe sticking out of my thigh. Someone had injected me with epinephrine. I sat up dazed and saw a younger student pulling the needle out. He was a certified EMT and, by pure luck, had been carrying epinephrine that day for a class presentation. Within minutes, I fully recovered with no complications. Story 9. My dad flipped the wrong breaker while we were replacing a light switch, and I got thrown across the room. I put my dad's truck on 2 wheels while taking a sharp corner because a cigarette landed on the seat right behind me. I fell off a 3-story log cabin frame onto gravel. I was chased down by a bull, and at the last second, my dad yanked me over the cattle gate, right as the bull crashed into it, denting the metal. I overdosed on a mixture of alcohol and Adderall. I fell out of a moving car while going 25 miles per hour while driving. I fell through the ice while fishing with my dad. A friend of mine almost drowned me in a lake when our canoe flipped. He couldn't swim, so I had to save him instead. I've been accidentally set on fire multiple times. Oh, and my brother intentionally threw me into a bonfire once. I think that's all of them, but I might be missing 1 or 2. Story 10. I once drove a Nissan Micra off a dirt road and into the woods at around 100 kilometers per hour. Somehow I barely cleared a massive rock, possibly helping the car hop further, and shot between trees, finally stopping about 25 meters deep into the forest. Also, there was a 40-kilogram shepherd dog in the car with me. When we crashed, the force of the impact sent the dog flying into my back, breaking both the seat and my seatbelt, making it completely useless. Because of that, I smashed my head into the windshield, cracking it. Honestly, it didn't even feel that bad. Even the dog was totally fine. But the physics behind it? That was shocking. Just the force of the dog hitting my back was over 800 kilograms, not even counting the car going from 80 kilometers per hour to a dead stop. All I walked away with was a bloody scratch on my forehead. The cops had a hard time believing what happened. Story 11. I was driving on the interstate, going about 85 miles per hour, with a concrete barrier to my left and an 18-wheeler to my right. Then my car started hydroplaning. For 10 to 15 agonizing seconds, I had zero control. The car wouldn't stop skidding, and no matter how hard I gripped the wheel, it kept trying to point toward either the concrete barrier or the truck. I was screaming. Eventually, the car came to a stop, facing oncoming traffic about a quarter mile from where the hydroplaning started. And then there was the time my plane was struck by lightning. It fried the onboard circuitry, and we had to make an emergency landing. Luckily, there was an airport within 10 minutes of us, because from that point on, it was a straight descent. Story 12. In 2018, Anchorage, AK, and the surrounding region experienced a 7.1 earthquake. I was living in a 3rd-story apartment in a cheaply built building on the edge of Baxter Bog, getting ready for work when it hit. The shaking lasted for minutes, and I had just enough time to dive into the small space between my bed and the wall. But I immediately regretted that decision because I was effectively pinned, my body wedged in so tightly that I had no wiggle room. Lying there on my side, my cheek smashed against the mattress, I was convinced this cheap building was about to slide straight into the bog across the street. I had enough time to contemplate life. At one point, a particularly violent stretch of shaking triggered a montage of memories flashing before my eyes. I even chuckled, picturing my body being discovered centuries from now, perfectly preserved in mud, looking like Peter Griffin when he falls on his face. Or worse, like Tom Segura attempting that ill-fated dunk. 'Tis a silly universe. Thankfully, Anchorage has strict building codes designed for earthquakes, and despite this one being among the most powerful in U.S. history, no one was killed. Still, my workplace didn't seem too impressed. I was actually written up for not showing up to work that day. Story 13. Back in the early 90s, I worked for a towing company. Part of our response area included a stretch of interstate that required special permits to operate on. It was somewhat exclusive, but the trade-off was brutal. Failing to respond within 30 minutes meant heavy fines or even losing the permit entirely. Basically, no matter the time or weather, if a call came in, you went. Most calls were routine. Hook the car, tow it, move on. But working on the side of a highway with trucks and cars flying past at full speed was always dangerous. There were no move-over laws back then. One call took me to a car that had broken down right next to a guardrail. There was barely any room to work. I did as much as I could from the passenger side of the tow truck, but to finish securing the vehicle to the flatbed, I had to step onto the driver's side. I was just tightening the last strap when I saw a truck approaching in my peripheral vision. He gave me room, but the truck behind him, he had no idea I was there. He wasn't doing anything wrong. It was just one of those blind spots where he couldn't see beyond the truck in front of him, and he wasn't tailgating. As they passed, the first truck veered slightly, giving me a decent berth. The second truck held his line. I flattened myself against the flatbed as much as possible, and in that moment, my entire life flashed before my eyes. That truck driver saw me at the last possible second and swerved, but to this day, I have no idea how he didn't hit me. It was so close that my shirt tails got caught on some part of the truck, ripping my shirt and yanking my hat clean off my head. It took me 2 or 3 hours to fully process what had just happened. I could have died right there, and the driver might not have even realized he had hit me. After that, I spent years working on roadways in heavy traffic, but I never took another risk. Every time I parked my vehicle at an angle, at least 100 feet back, with the wheels turned away from me. I set up flares a few hundred feet behind me, wore a safety vest, and took every possible precaution. But the strangest part of all, even 30 years later, I vividly remember that life flash. It was real. So many moments from my life rushed through my mind in what was probably less than a second, from the moment I first sensed danger to when it was over. I've always wondered if anyone else has experienced that and what it was like for them. Story 14. The brakes on my bicycle failed at the worst possible moment. I was on a 2-day expedition with the scouts, carrying a full pack of gear on my back, weighing me down. Just as I reached the crest of the largest descent of our entire route, a brutal 16% gradient lasting a quarter mile, ending in a sharp U-turn at the bottom, my brake pads burned out completely. By the time I realized they had failed and weren't just covered in mud, I was already going too fast to stop. I considered jamming my foot in the wheel or scraping my heels, but at nearly 40 miles per hour, I knew that would just end in injury. As I hit the bottom, by all accounts doing at least 50 miles per hour, I lost control. There was no way to make the turn, so I went straight off the track and into a massive nettle bush, gathering thousands of stings all over my body as I continued at high speed. At some point, I became airborne, and I felt my bike drift away from me. In that moment, I thought, this is it. Next thing I knew, I opened my eyes and found myself tangled in tree branches at the bottom of a ditch. My bike was suspended above me, about 3 feet up, also caught in the branches. My friend called down, "Are you okay?" I wriggled around to check. Aside from the fiery burn of what felt like a million nettle stings, I was miraculously fine. They helped drag me out of the ditch, and we stared in shock at the distance I had traveled. I had smashed through branches as thick as my arm, head first apparently. Thank God for my helmet. My pack had broken my fall and probably saved my spine. That was one very lucky day. I didn't ride a bike again for a year after that. Story 15. I went cliff jumping, hit the water badly, and heard a massive crack. For a few seconds, I couldn't feel anything. As I floated deep underwater in eerie silence, I genuinely thought I had broken multiple bones. Or worse, my back. I started wiggling my toes one by one, then my legs and arms. Everything seemed to be working. Relieved, I swam to the surface. But as I started making my way back to shore, my legs began to ache badly. Within moments, they hurt so much I couldn't use them at all. I had no choice but to swim the entire way back, using only my arms. When I finally reached the shore, I could walk again, but the pain was brutal. Turns out I had hit the water in a semi-seated position, and the backs of my thighs had impacted the surface like it was concrete. I walked away with some seriously impressive bruises, but no other injuries. Story 16. In high school, just after the school year ended, I was at a friend's house about 45 minutes from home. I left about 20 minutes before my curfew, which meant, of course, I was speeding. Not anything insane, but still pushing 60 miles per hour in a 45 zone on a back road. It had rained earlier, so the road was damp, but not overly slick. Everything was fine until I saw a sign that said 25 miles per hour and realized the road had a sharp left jog ahead. It wasn't a huge curve, but I panicked and slammed on the brakes. The car immediately turned sideways. I was suddenly staring at houses through my driver's side window, completely convinced I was about to plow straight into someone's living room. If I was lucky, I'd only kill myself. Then somehow the car straightened out. Except now, I was fully off the road, skidding through the grass, heading straight for a tree. A road sign flashed into my headlights and I obliterated it. Finally, I managed to come to a stop. After sliding nearly 100 yards in about 5 seconds, shaken, I pulled into a nearby neighborhood, got out, and walked around to calm down. The first house to the left was up on a hill, and the owner came out to check on me. He asked if I was okay, then casually mentioned that a lot of people crashed at that exact spot. He didn't call me an idiot outright, but he didn't have to. I got the message loud and clear. I drove home much more cautiously after that. I got in trouble for being late, And when I told my mom what had happened, she let me decide whether or not to tell my dad. I chose not to. Of course, he eventually noticed the grass in the wheels and the sign-shaped dent in the bumper. I just shrugged it off, and he didn't press me for details. Not until years later, long after I had moved out, when he randomly brought it up again, that's when I finally told my family the whole story. Story 17. Back in high school, my friends and I had a game called You're My B. The rules were simple. Someone would say, "You're my B if," followed by a dare, and if you didn't do it, well, you were their B. Stupid? Absolutely. But that didn't stop us. One night I was driving. I had gotten my license about a month prior and needed to drop my 2 friends off before my curfew. We turned onto the road leading to my buddy's neighborhood, approaching a long curve, when one of them turned to me and said, "You're my B if you don't hit 70 miles per hour." Now, this wasn't a difficult task, but it was a terrible place for it. Well, I wasn't about to be anybody's buddy, so I floored it. We hit 70 miles per hour in no time, and I immediately lost control. The car slid straight into a tall, blunt curb, launching us airborne for about 10 feet. When we hit the ground, I accidentally slammed my foot on the accelerator instead of the brake, and we shot forward another 20 feet, right into a pine tree. The impact uprooted the tree entirely, and we landed on the root base with my driver's side door pinned against the ground. We had to drop down through the passenger side to climb out. We got really lucky. If I had lost control just a fraction of a second later, we would have slammed into a row of parked cars. A fraction earlier, and we would have crashed straight into someone's walkout basement. We also narrowly avoided hitting the neighborhood's electrical junction station. The car was totaled. Worse yet, it was my parents' brand new 1994 Honda Accord, barely a month old. My, "Yep, I'm definitely dead" moment happened the second we hit the curb, but somehow all 3 of us walked away completely fine. The only injury was a tiny scrape on my right thumb from the airbag deploying. It was a miracle we didn't end up in the hospital. Or worse. Story 18. When I was 19, my friend and I decided to float down the river near our college on an air mattress. We didn't have any inner tubes, so we figured it would work just as well. It did not. We planned to get out before going under the bridge, because the current there was insane. Kayakers used it to practice their balance, and there was a massive rock slab along the bank that jutted dangerously far into the river. The last thing we wanted was to get caught in that mess. But as we tried to paddle toward shore, the current yanked us back. Before we could react, we were sucked under the bridge. The waves folded the air mattress in half, flipped us over, and swallowed us beneath the water. The current was brutal. We thrashed around, completely submerged, just fighting to surface. For a few terrifying seconds, I had no idea which way was up. When we finally broke through, gasping for air, we realized something horrifying. We had been pulled completely under the rock embankment. Somehow, instead of getting smashed against the rocks, we had shot through and resurfaced farther down the river, miraculously unharmed. As we caught our breath, we noticed dozens of people staring at us, some from the bank, others from the bridge, watching the 2 idiots who had almost gotten themselves killed on an air mattress. Story 19. In 2012, I was at a friend's house with a girl I was seeing. There were about 8 of us there, some of whom lived in the house. One of the guys who lived there was a well-known drug dealer, mostly selling weed, but also dealing in other substances. We all knew this, and some of us even worked with or for him. Another guy who had recently moved back from a nearby city was out on bond for drug distribution charges. He had a lot of connections and routinely transported material for sale. At the time, a nearby associate had recently been robbed and beaten. So the general rule was that both the front and back doors stayed locked unless someone was coming or going. At some point, a friend asked if I wanted to step outside for a cigarette. I said no, since I didn't want to turn off the girl I was with. He got up, exited through the back door, and walked around to the front to smoke. He left the door unlocked. None of us noticed, until a few minutes later when the back door flew open. 3 or 4 masked men rushed into the house with guns drawn, ordering everyone to the ground. At first we hesitated, until one of them pistol whipped a friend sitting across from me and the girl I was with. That was enough. We hit the floor. I shielded the girl by lying on top of her. The intruders kept demanding to know where the drugs were. No one answered at first, but eventually one person pointed to a bedroom, then another. The leader of the crew pistol-whipped anyone who lifted their head to speak. When they kept asking the same question, I pointed at the room and shouted that the drugs were inside. I got pistol-whipped once, but one of my friends who was lying in the middle of the room wasn't so lucky. He was the easiest target. and they kept beating him over and over. Then a gunshot. While assaulting my friend, one of the guys accidentally pulled the trigger. The bullet struck my friend in the back, piercing his heart. He died instantly. For a few seconds, we all thought we were next, but then silence. When we looked up, the intruders were gone. They had fled. They were caught later. The shooter was only 17 years old. He got 50 years in prison. The other 3, a little older, each got 20. Story 20. When I was 13, my dad, older brother, nephew, and I went fishing at a reservoir in Utah. It was February, meaning it was cold as hell, probably around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. We were out on this rickety little boat in the middle of the lake, freezing our asses off, and hadn't gotten so much as a bite all day. My dad, being the jokester he was, decided to cast his line backwards over his head, just to switch things up. Within a minute, his fishing pole bent hard. He had hooked something big. My dad was a big guy, around 250 pounds, and in his excitement, he stood up in this tiny, unstable boat to reel it in. That was all it took. Within seconds, the boat flipped, sending all 4 of us into the frigid water. We were hundreds of feet from shore. The moment I hit the water, my body locked up. My muscles froze instantly. I couldn't even move. I was in shock, completely paralyzed by the cold. Thankfully, my dad and brother grabbed me and dragged me to the overturned boat, where we hung on for dear life. But the reality was setting in. Hypothermia was about to kick in fast, and if we didn't drown first, the cold would kill us within minutes. Then, by some miracle, a man on a motorboat saw us capsize and sped over to help. He pulled us out of the water and took us to shore, right near where our car was parked. My nephew and I sat in the car, stripped down to our underwear with the heat cranked all the way up, while my dad and brother gathered what little we could salvage before we left. We were shaken and terrified, but alive. If that man hadn't seen us flip and come to our rescue, I know we wouldn't have made it. Story 21. I went hiking alone in the Smoky Mountains while on a business trip. Traffic was terrible, so I got there later than planned and only had 1 bottle of water. I had never been there before, but I'd done plenty of hiking, so I wasn't too worried. At the turnaround point, I felt great, so instead of heading back, I kept going. By the time I reached the top, the sun had started to set. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and clumsy from fatigue, but I tried jogging anyway. That's when I felt myself falling, right at the edge of a cliff. By some miracle, there was a wire fence around the mountain. I grabbed onto it just in time, and it saved my life. Not only would I have likely died from the fall, but even if I had survived, no one would have found me for at least a day. If I had been knocked unconscious, they might not have found my body for a long time. Lesson learned: don't hike alone in an unfamiliar place without telling anyone where you're going. I also rolled my ankle on the way back, but luckily I was close enough to the car by then. Story 22. One day I had a massive headache, and then I went blind for about an hour. I casually mentioned it on Reddit, and people freaked out, telling me to get to an ER immediately. I called my doctor instead, thinking they were overreacting, but he freaked out too. He told me he was faxing the hospital to expect me, and that I needed to get to the ER right now. When I arrived, the nurses were casual at first, until they found out why I was there. Their faces went pale. Within minutes, everyone had me convinced I was about to drop dead from a massive stroke. So I spent the entire day and evening, until about 1 a.m. sitting in waiting rooms, getting blood drawn, CAT scans, and a bunch of other tests. The whole time, everybody was treating me like this might be my last day on earth. And yet, it was also the most boring experience of my life. It was like someone saying, "Hey, you're about to die. Now sit here and wait for the bus for 6 hours." There was nothing to do but sit there and contemplate imminent death. And I guess I made peace with it. Honestly, I can say I'm ready. My father-in-law passed away recently, and it made me realize I don't need to accomplish anything else. If I died today, it wouldn't be a tragedy. It would just be my time. That said, I love living, and I'm in no rush. But every day feels like a bonus. Oh, and the bottom line? It was just a freak migraine. I've never had a migraine before or since, which is why everyone was so worried. Story 23. IED Afghanistan, 2013. I had just turned 20. We were rolling through the middle of nowhere, somewhere between FOB Leatherneck and Dwyer. No roads, just sand and camels. I was in the lead vehicle, sitting on the ring of my turret, super exposed and smoking a cigarette. For the record, don't do that. Smoking and sitting on top of a turret both kill. We reached a wadi, a dried-out riverbed, and I finally got back inside the turret like a good soldier. The whole place stank, but we pushed forward. Then boom, the truck behind me disappeared in a cloud of dust. And all I heard was nothing. Explosions that big are weird. There's so much stimulus that your brain just shuts off. I can't even tell you what it sounded like. But I can tell you what it felt like. Like standing in front of a leaf blower, but colder. The shock wave pushed back all the fluid in my face, and tiny bits of debris stung my skin. The truck behind me, about 100 feet away, had hit an IED. Thankfully, they had a mine roller on the front of their vehicle. It wasn't there anymore, but they were okay. As for me, the IED was packed with shrapnel, but none of the flying debris hit me. The little stings I felt were just sand and rocks. When route clearance showed up, they swept the area. Turns out the reason the wadi smelled so bad was because the debris littering the ground, that was what was left of a camel. It had stepped on another, much larger IED. For years, I kept thinking about it. Every time I saw a red light camera flash in my rearview mirror, I'd have a moment. But now, I'm good. That day changed my entire outlook on life. Because in so many other scenarios, my ticket would have been punched. And since then, every single day has felt like a gift. Story 24. I was riding snowmobiles with my best buddy when we were much younger. I had almost no experience with them. And the one I was using was an older model with the skis set really close together, making it super tippy. We were tearing through the trails, him behind me, both of us laughing and having the time of our lives. Obviously, since I was in front, I wanted to go faster than him. That's when we hit a section of the trail with a sharp turn, way sharper than I could handle. I cranked the steering hard to the right, but instead of making the turn, I got launched into the air at full speed. In that split second, I noticed a downed log up ahead, covered in sharp, jagged branches sticking out in every direction. I was flying straight toward it. For sure, I thought I was about to get impaled. But somehow my body avoided every single branch, landing perfectly between them. I just lay there staring at the sticks pointing all around me, completely unscathed. My friend skidded to a stop, both of us in total shock for a few seconds. Then without saying much, we just got back on the snowmobiles and kept riding like nothing happened. Good times. Story 25. Back in Dallas in 2010, I was driving down one of those wide open highways, heading southbound at around 80 miles per hour. Yes, I was speeding, but the limit was 75. I had just passed an 18-wheeler when a car suddenly swerved in front of the truck and then into my lane, cutting me off. I reacted instantly, jerking my steering wheel left toward the shoulder to avoid being hit. But I overcorrected, way too hard, and lost control of my car. The highway divider wall was now directly in front of me, so I swerved back the other way, right into the path of the truck I had just passed. Panic kicked in, and I swerved again. But this time, I was headed straight for the guardrail. At this point, I let go of the wheel and just screamed, thinking, please, just hit something so this spinning stops. My car spun out of control, whipping back and forth like a rag doll. It felt like forever, but in reality, it was probably just a few seconds. When everything stopped, I realized I was now facing the wrong direction, sitting smack in the middle of the highway. Through my windshield, I saw 4 vehicles, 2 18-wheelers and 2 trucks, completely stopped in the road, waiting for me. They had held up traffic to avoid hitting me. I hadn't hit anything. Not the car that cut me off, not the truck, not the divider, not the guardrail, nothing. My little white 2009 Toyota Yaris was completely untouched. I sat there gripping the wheel, my heart pounding, and let out the deepest breath of my life. Then I slowly turned the car around and kept driving. As I passed the other vehicles, some drivers waved or gave me a thumbs up. I smiled back, but inside I was still in full-blown panic mode. Story 26. When I was around 12, I was visiting my uncle's farm. He had a couple of smaller quads that we'd ride around on, and after spending the day riding with him, he trusted me to take one out on my own, with the strict rule that I wasn't allowed to go past second gear. Of course, the second I was out of earshot, I gunned it. Now, my uncle raised cows, and to keep them in certain pastures, he used movable electric fences, just a single 1/8-inch wire stretched 300 meters across, held up by white plastic supports spaced about 50 meters apart. I was heading back toward the house as the sun started setting, absolutely ripping across a field in 4th gear, full throttle. Then at the last second, I saw the wire. I instinctively stood up and slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The wire caught me right across the stomach and launched me off the quad. For a split second, I was suspended in the air, and I swear the wire stretched back like a slingshot. I had just enough time to think, this is how I die, before it catapulted me a full 20 feet backward. I landed hard, but miraculously wasn't hurt. The ride back was very slow and very careful. Didn't go past second gear. Story 27. When I was 19, I was driving to the airport at night to pick up my dad. I was cruising down the highway at about 65 miles per hour when I came up behind an old Honda Odyssey going 40 miles per hour with its hazards on. Since the speed limit was 65, I figured I'd just pass it. As I pulled into the left lane to overtake, I suddenly noticed sparks flying in the road ahead. A second later, the van's front wheel, rim and all, detached and shot straight into my lane. I had maybe a split second to react. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. I hit the loose wheel head-on with my passenger side tire, and the impact sent my car onto two wheels, tilting at an angle while still going at least 55 miles per hour. For a terrifying 3 seconds, my car was practically on its side. I kept thinking, oh, this is it. I'm gonna flip. But somehow I didn't. The car finally came back down onto all four wheels, and I swerved back and forth between two lanes for nearly a quarter mile before I could regain control. In shock, I drove another half mile before finally pulling over. Me and the other driver, who had just lost his wheel, were both okay. But that was, without a doubt, the scariest moment of my life. Story 28. Back when I was very young and living with my grandparents, I was playing alone outside with a stick, swinging it around like a sword. Eventually, I went inside but kept waving it around like an idiot. Not long after, I accidentally knocked my grandma's glasses off the table. They hit the floor and shattered. We were poor back then, lived in a shack, barely getting by. Even basic necessities were expensive. So I knew how much of a struggle it must have been for her to afford those glasses in the first place. The second they broke, I knew I was dead. To make things worse, my grandma was outside clearing the back of the house with a machete. I remember thinking, she's going to cut me into pieces and feed me to the pigs. I don't even remember crying. Just a sinking feeling of pure dread as she walked in and saw her broken glasses. She scolded me, but she didn't cut me into pieces. Story 29. I almost drowned at La Jolla this year. The tide kept pulling me farther and farther out, but I didn't even notice at first. I was just messing around with my boogie board, having fun, until I glanced back at the shore and realized I was way farther out than anyone else. Panic set in. I started kicking as hard as I could to get back, but no matter how much I tried, I kept getting pulled out even farther. The waves were massive, sometimes making the shore completely disappear from my view. That's when I started to really freak out, because if I couldn't see the shore, there was a good chance no one could see me either. For some reason, I thought my boogie board was making things worse, so in a dramatic move, I threw it away. Then I started swimming toward the shore with everything I had. That's when I realized I wasn't just struggling, I was caught in a rip current. I had never been caught in one before, so I didn't really understand what was happening. I just knew I was exhausted. The more I fought, the weaker I got. That's when I stopped trying to fight it and focused only on staying afloat. I started waving my arms and screaming for help, but I remember thinking, nobody can hear me. And worse, I realized that from a distance, I probably didn't even look like I was in danger. For a few moments, I genuinely thought, this is it. I'm going to drown. Then out of nowhere, I saw the lifeguard swimming toward me. Guess I wasn't going to die after all. Story 30. I was in an awful car crash on the freeway at 12:30 a.m. when traffic was light. A Honda Accord going at least 80 or 90 miles per hour tried to squeeze between me and my Nissan Cube and an 18-wheeler. I remember seeing him enter my blind spot, but he never appeared in my periphery. Just as I was processing how odd that was, I caught his headlights swerving in my side mirror. Before I could react, he lost control and slammed into the back of my car. I rolled over and skidded down the freeway upside down. Time slowed as I watched sparks fly from my car's roof, scraping against the asphalt. My only thought was, well, this is how I die, and this terrifying image will be my last memory. Then I slammed into the guardrail on the opposite side of the freeway. My music still playing as I hung upside down in my seatbelt. Somehow I managed to get the door open, unbuckle, and roll out. The passenger side was completely demolished. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but it was still connected to Bluetooth, and I couldn't hear anything. I managed to turn off the car and call again, but the call wouldn't go through. Meanwhile, the guy who hit me had also ended up upside down, but instead of calling for help, he ran up to me and told me to call a tow truck instead of 911. I told him, our cars are upside down on the freeway. I'm calling 911. Then he took off on foot. The 18-wheeler had somehow ended up on the opposite side of me, knocking over the guardrail and hanging halfway off the grade. That meant that while we were both spinning out of control, we had actually crossed paths, and yet he had somehow managed to avoid hitting me. That guy must have been one hell of a driver. Thinking back, I reasoned that the Honda must have hit the truck first, then bounced off it, and then crashed into me. But beyond the truck driver's insane reflexes, I also believe I survived because of my Cube's high boxy roof. I'm a tall guy, but my head never touched the ceiling of the car, even while flipping. People always made fun of me for driving a Cube, but that weird-shaped car saved my life that night. The insurance nightmare that followed was a whole different kind of disaster. But that's a story for another day. Story 31. Before my first chemotherapy treatment, my doctor warned me about a rare side effect that could trigger an allergic reaction, and in very rare cases, even be fatal. I shrugged it off. What else could I do? Fast forward to the actual treatment. I was hospitalized and my dad was sitting beside me. The nurse plugged in the IV and started the treatment, then left the room. About 15 minutes passed. Everything was fine, so my dad stepped out to grab a drink. Another 10 minutes went by, and I started to feel nauseous. I brushed it off as a normal chemo side effect, until within seconds, the nausea exploded into something far worse. A crushing pressure built up in my skull, my vision tunneled, and I could barely breathe. That's when it hit me. This is it. This is the reaction they were talking about. I had just started treatment, and my dad was going to walk back in to find his son dead on the floor. Goodbye, world. Then suddenly the nurse sprinted into the room and shut off the IV. Instantly, all the symptoms disappeared. Turns out it wasn't the rare, deadly reaction at all. It was just a known side effect that feels like you're dying, but isn't actually dangerous. The doctor later apologized for not warning me beforehand, practically giving me a heart attack for no reason. Story 32. I was attached to a submarine that was sinking at night, with no working air systems, and no one realized there was a problem. The sub dropped down to about 40 feet, while I was stuck hanging above it, tangled in multiple air and communication lines. As I struggled to free myself, I felt my vision starting to gray out, tunnel vision creeping in. I knew I was running out of time. Desperate, I pulled myself down the tangled lines back to the submarine, reaching in blindly for a regulator. I knew all the air systems were dead, but I was hoping, just hoping, that there was some residual air left in the lines. Pure luck. My hand landed on the regulator for a spare pony bottle. I got it in my mouth just before blacking out. When I came to, I was still hanging above the sub, the pony bottle dangling below me, my mouth clamped onto the regulator mouthpiece. My dive buddy had surfaced because he had missed everything while doing his pre-dive checklist. He didn't see me when we hit the bottom, assumed I had ditched him, and went up. Meanwhile, the surface support crew just thought I was still diving as usual. After my buddy surfaced and I didn't, they waited another 4 or 5 minutes before sending a rescue diver down. By the time they got to me, I was done, mentally checked out, ready for early retirement. But instead, they tied a rope around my waist and sent me back down solo to retrieve the submarine. Story 33. I was driving home after Christmas, a long snowy drive, about 4 hours of it. Then suddenly the weather cleared up. The roads looked fine, so I sped up to around 80 kilometers per hour. Then I hit a patch of black ice. My car started spinning. I had just passed over a bridge when I lost control, and now I was headed straight for a rock face on the side of the road. I had just enough time to think, I'm either dead or seriously injured. Then somehow my car changed direction. I went backwards across the eastbound lanes, through the patch of grass dividing the highway, and then across the westbound lanes. As I slid, I looked out my driver's side window and saw a wall of cars coming straight for me. Then somehow, I finally stopped. I was facing west, slightly down a hill, completely off the road. I sat there for a second, completely shaken, then called my mom, a tow truck, and worked to let them know I wouldn't be coming in for my shift. While waiting for the tow truck, 2 police cars pulled up. One officer looked at me, listened to what happened, shook his head, and then just stared at me. "Where's your halo?" he asked, "because you should be dead." My car had only minor scratches. 2 tow trucks had to wedge it out of the snow, and then I was back on the road. The remaining 3-hour drive home took me closer to 5, white-knuckling the steering wheel the entire way. Normally, it would have taken half that time, but I was still shaken to the core. Story 34. I have a nephew close to my age. We were like brothers growing up. One night when I was about 17, we got bored and decided to just drive around the city. It was probably around 1 a.m. If you're wondering, no, our parents didn't care since we were considered good kids and never got into more trouble than the occasional speeding ticket. We were just cruising down random freeways when a light rain started. I was driving and didn't notice that my speed was creeping up. We approached a notoriously sharp curve, and I just assumed I was going the correct speed. I wasn't. I was in the far left lane of a 4-lane freeway, heading straight into a tight left-hand curve when the car suddenly spun out. It felt like it spun for eternity. I had no idea how to correct it. My area doesn't get snow or ice, so I'd never learned how to recover from a skid. My nephew and I just sat there, waiting for the inevitable crash, either into the wall or into another vehicle. The scariest part? This was an industrial area full of massive big rigs. Then somehow we came to a stop, perfectly in the right lane, completely unscathed. The only problem? We were now facing the wrong direction. We sat there in stunned silence for a few seconds, processing what had just happened. Then out of nowhere, we both burst into uncontrollable laughter, probably harder than I've ever laughed in my life, even decades later. We swore that nobody would ever hear about what happened. Well, the adults never heard the story, but there was no way we weren't telling our friends. Story 35. I hydroplaned on a limited access highway, basically an interstate, but in a more rural area, while going about 75 miles per hour. I lost control almost instantly and spun in a full 540-degree turn, sliding from the right lane across the left lane and straight down the embankment on the side of the road. The only reason I had a relatively soft landing? Pure dumb luck. There just happened to be a giant pile of mulch sitting there, which my car slammed into. If that mulch hadn't been there, I would have gone straight into a tree. And worse, there were a few thick branches sticking out right in the path my car was headed. If I had hit them at that speed, I could have easily been impaled or, at the very least, seriously injured. Instead, I walked away without a single scratch. Some good old boys in big trucks happened to be driving by, I'm from the South, and they pulled over to check on me. They offered to call for help, but I was just standing there completely in shock at how I had somehow gotten out of that without a single injury. I was 100% sure I was dead while I was spinning. So yeah, don't drive that fast when it's raining. It's dumb. I was dumb. If the speed limit is 70 and the roads are wet, you shouldn't be going 5 over. You should be going 10 under. Story 36. I was riding my motorcycle through a field on some property my dad owned, really moving at a pretty good clip. The land wasn't completely cleared yet, but I didn't realize how much of an issue that would be until it was too late. Thick grass covered everything, hiding the fact that an old barbed wire fence had been knocked down but never removed. At one point, a loose section of wire had formed a slack loop about a foot or two off the ground. Somehow, I perfectly caught this loop around my brake pedal. From my perspective, I was cruising along at high speed, and then in an instant, my bike was just gone, completely ripped out from under me. My body, however, was still going full speed. I had just enough time to think, what the hell just happened? Before I slammed into the ground and started rolling. Miraculously, I got up with just a few scratches and scrapes. I got incredibly lucky there was no stationary object in my path. No tree, no stump, no fence post, no rock. Nothing that could have stopped me much more violently. When I walked back to my bike, I saw that the brake pedal had been yanked so far backward that it was touching the exhaust. Somehow, despite all that force, my foot was completely fine. I still have no idea how that happened. My best guess is that I must have been repositioning it at the exact moment the wire caught, but I don't remember that part clearly. All I know is that the wire grabbed my bike, not my leg, and for that I'm very grateful. Story 37. I was out skiing, taking it very slow because the weather was even worse than I expected. The fog was so thick I could barely see anything, and the ice made everything treacherous. Then, of course, I slipped. Instead of falling like a normal person, my body decided it would be a great idea to launch me headfirst down the mountain, on my back. The moment I hit the ground, I heard a crack. All I could see above me was pure white fog. I was lying there, head pointing downhill, thinking, shish. I tried to lift myself up, but I couldn't move my head. Panic set in instantly. Did I just break my neck? Was that crack a vertebra snapping? I refused to believe this was happening. Out of pure instinct, I tried wiggling my big toe, something I do to snap out of sleep paralysis. It moved. Okay, maybe I'm not paralyzed. I moved my arms, then my legs. Everything seemed to be working fine, but when I tried to lift my head again, nothing. By this time, my parents had noticed my fall and crawled back up the mountain to help me. They got me on my feet, and surprisingly, I was able to make my way down, very carefully. My neck felt stiff, but I could turn it left and right, so I figured I was okay. Back at the hotel, I decided to lie down for a bit. Then when I tried to sit up, I realized something horrifying. I couldn't. I literally couldn't lift my own head. The only way I could sit up was by holding my head in my hands like a giant, creepy baby whose neck muscles hadn't developed yet. We eventually went to the hospital, where I found out I had massively overstretched the muscles and tendons in the front of my neck. They were so strained that they physically couldn't lift the weight of my own head. The adventure didn't stop there, but this story is already long enough, so I'll spare you the sequel. Story 38, Labor Day 2000. I was the only one in the house who had to work and needed to be in before dawn. My truck was a stick shift that leaked oil, a detail that would become important soon. I got in, cranked it, then noticed the dashboard lit up, indicating it needed oil. So I shut it off, popped the hood, and stepped out. That's when I realized two very important things. First, my truck was parked on an incline. Second, I had already taken off the parking brake and never put it back on. The truck started rolling backward. I was wearing boots, and in a split-second decision, I figured I could jump back in and push the brake down. Bad call. I slipped, one foot got stuck under the brake pedal, and my other foot, which had been on the ground, was now in the air. My boot was wedged tightly, too snug to pull free. The next thing I knew, I was upside down, being dragged across the yard with my face just inches from the front driver's side tire. At that moment, I had a new, much more urgent realization. The truck was headed toward one of two places, the ditch in front of my house or the gully across the street. Both were full of water. Worse, the sides were steep, uneven, and lined with jagged rocks that would break me apart if I hit them. I was either going to be dislodged and run over or knocked unconscious by the rocks and drown. Then just as suddenly as it all started, the truck hit a bump in the yard. The jolt simultaneously released my foot, lurched the vehicle slightly to the passenger's side, and bounced it just enough that the front tire only barely grazed my arm before rolling on. It kept moving until one of the wheels dropped into the ditch and stopped cold. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Afterward, I did what any sane person would do. I grabbed my cigarettes and the oil from the cab, stood there shaking as I smoked, topped off the oil, and then drove to work. I'm here, because bills don't care if you almost die. They just care that they get paid. Story 39. My husband and I were driving to the California coast, taking a road we'd never been on before, that wound through the coastal mountain ranges. As we reached the top of a mountain, I casually mentioned how far the drop was, at least a few hundred feet, no trees, no guardrail. My husband turned his head to look. Then I noticed the car slowing and drifting into the opposite lane. I looked over and realized he was having a seizure. I started yelling, but of course, he wasn't responding. The car continued drifting toward the cliff, and for a moment I thought, well, at least his foot's off the accelerator. Then the seizure intensified, and his foot slammed on the gas. We were going straight for the edge. I grabbed the wheel and yanked us in the opposite direction, toward the mountain. By some miracle, there was a turnout up ahead, and I spotted a culvert drain sticking up in the ditch. With no other option, I aimed straight for it. We hit it at over 40 miles per hour. The impact set off all the airbags. The car bounced up the hillside before rolling, once, twice, before finally stopping. I never lost consciousness, but I just kept thinking, please let the car stop rolling. Please don't let us go down the hill anyway. When it finally came to a stop, I unbuckled my seatbelt and tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. My husband was still seizing, suspended above me by his seatbelt. Then I heard voices outside. People had stopped to help. Someone told me to stand up. That's when I realized the car was on its passenger side. I stood up, stuck my head out of the driver's window, and saw them waiting. The engine's smoking, someone said. They pulled me out. More people had stopped, including off-duty EMTs, who got the fire under control and worked on tipping the car back over so they could reach my husband. We rode to the hospital in an ambulance together. Miraculously, neither of us had any serious injuries. I had some bruises and a nasty seatbelt burn, but that was it. The fire chief who saw our car later told us that when they usually come up on wrecks like that, they're pulling out bodies. We were pretty damn lucky. Story 40. I fell through a frozen pond once. The entire surface was covered in snow, so I had no idea it was even there until it was too late. The second I broke through, it felt like a million needles piercing my body all at once. The shock was instant and overwhelming. I tried to swim upward, but my clothes were dragging me down, making every movement harder. Worse, I hadn't even taken a breath before I fell in, meaning no oxygen was getting to my brain. Panic set in. I was alone. No one knew I was there. For a brief moment, I thought about giving up, but then my survival instinct kicked in, and I started fighting even harder. Somehow, I managed to get my hands above the water and clawed at the ice. That's when an ice fisher nearby saw the splashes. Turns out, I had fallen into a common fishing spot. He rushed over, grabbed one of my hands and pulled me toward the edge of the hole I had created in the ice. He climbed out, ran to his truck and threw me a rope while I held onto the ice for dear life. I gripped it tight as he towed me out, inch by inch, until I was finally back on solid ground. He probably saved my life. I don't even want to think about what would have happened if I had gone under. If I had drowned, I don't know if anyone would have ever found me. Story 41. When I was 14, I had a summer job as a brickie on a construction site. My job was to haul cavity blocks, massive bricks, up to the bricklayers working at the top of the building. These bricks were delivered by the hundreds, and it was my job to make sure they got where they needed to go. One Thursday afternoon, as I was carrying bricks up the scaffolding, I stepped onto one to give myself extra height and make lifting them easier. That was a mistake. The brick shifted, and before I could react, I was pitched into the air. I was over 4 stories up. As I fell, I hit a plank about halfway down, which barely slowed my descent. I remember staring at the ground, rushing toward me between my hands and thinking, okay, here goes. Cheerio. Then BAM. I opened my eyes and saw a block on the ground just inches from my face. If I had landed a little differently, that thing would have caved my skull in. I lay there for a second, gingerly wiggled my fingers. They moved. Wiggled my toes. Those moved too. Slowly I stood up. I walked away with scratches, bruises, and a scar on my right arm that I still have to this day. No broken bones. And somehow I was back up on that scaffolding, working the following Saturday morning. Story 42. I was in a car crash with 4 other friends during university. We were driving back from a trip to some islands in a small, absolute beater of a car. I don't even think any of us were wearing seatbelts. We were on the highway, probably speeding, when the guy driving fell asleep at the wheel. I still remember my friend in the front passenger seat poking him awake as the car started drifting. The driver jolted awake, panicked, and jerked the steering wheel way too hard. He lost control completely and the car spun out. I can still picture it in slow motion. One thought after another ran through my head. Oh crap, we're going to die. Then this is really how it ends. Finally, the worst thought of all, my mom is going to be devastated. Then it stopped. We had smashed into 2 other vehicles while spinning, but somehow none of us were hurt. The worst injury? A smashed phone in my friend's pocket. But he was fine. We were all fine. I still can't believe how lucky we got.